Welcome everyone. My name is Mark Hallett. I'm the Merit Rising Director of the Courtauld, and it's an absolute treat to welcome all of you here to this very special occasion, a very celebratory occasion, but also one where there's going to be some really interesting discussion and debate around architecture and architectural theory. And as I said, it's a celebratory event, and really what we're here first and foremost to do is to celebrate the publication of Christopher Tadgell's wonderful book, The Louvre and Versailles, the evolution of the prototypical palace in the Age of Absolutism, which is a pretty powerful title in its own right. And what we decided to do, we thought this would make it especially interesting for everyone, was to organise an in-conversation between Christopher and two very distinguished interlocutors. And I'm also very, very happy and delighted to welcome not only Christopher, but Tim Knox and Nick Penny earlier with us to lead a conversation and to ask Christopher a number of questions, both about his own life and trajectory as an architectural historian, his career. So we learn a bit more about everything that's led up to the publication and research and the writing of this book. But also then Tim will be asking Christopher a few questions about the book itself. And if we've got time and inclination, we'll also have a chance for a few questions from the audience to Christopher about his projects and about this book in particular. And then I'll be delighted to invite all of you next door where we'll be serving drinks, and you'll have the chance to purchase the book should you so wish to do so. So a really nice next hour or so in prospect. But before we begin, and before I turn over to the panel, I just thought I'd better say a few words of introduction. And it is wonderful that we have three very distinguished Courtauld alumni here with us this afternoon. And first and foremost, of course, Christopher Tadgell himself, who graduated from the Courtauld with a PhD in 1974 and studied art history here, and was awarded a PhD here for a thesis on a neoclassical architectural theorist, Jacques Gabriel. And then Christopher subsequently taught in London at the Kent Institute for Art and Design in Canterbury, with interludes as the F.L. Morgan Professor of Architectural Design at the University of Louisville, and as a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, so an exceptionally distinguished career. And of course he's most famous for his publications. And of his publications on architecture, his book on Gabriel remains the definitive monograph on this important architect, and his history of architecture in India, demonstrating his range and a range of his interest, has also been seen as a definitive one-volume account of the subject, and that's now been comprehensively updated and revised in this extraordinary continual energy on Christopher's part as the book now called Architecture in the Indian Subcontinent, from the Mayuras to the Mughals, which is reissued by Routledge in 2023. So it's wonderful to welcome Christopher with us tonight. But in terms of the people who will be asking him some questions and asking him to open out about his career and about this fantastic book, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome first of all Sir Nicholas Penny, our third, as I said, Courtauld alumnus, who was director of the National Gallery between 2008 and 2015. Nick is one of the UK's most distinguished curators and art historians. I think we can very confidently say that, who before his tenure at the National Gallery enjoyed a succession of important curatorial roles at institutions ranging from the Ashmolean to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. He's famous as a co-author of one of the great art historical texts, Taste of the Antique, which he co-authored with the equally great Francis Haskell, which has recently been reissued in a new edition. And closest to my own heart is this great exhibition catalogue on Joshua Reynolds, which to accompany the seminal Royal Academy exhibition on the artist in 1986, which, when I was writing my own book on Reynolds, was one of my absolutely prime reference points, and always an endless source of knowledge and interest. And then finally we have Tim Knox, another alumnus of the Courtauld, director of the Royal Collection, a role he has held and enjoyed since 2018. This distinguished role follows a succession of other important jobs in the museum and heritage sector. In 1995, he joined the National Trust as its architectural historian. In 2002, became that organisation's head curator. And from 2005 to 2013, he was director of the John Soanes Museum in London. And then from 2013 to 18, prior to taking up his current role, was director of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. So a wonderful group of scholars here with us tonight. And I'll now turn over to you, Nick, to ask a few questions of Christopher about his trajectory as an architectural historian. So can I ask you first of all, though, to welcome our three panellists.
So, Christopher, this volume is discreetly dedicated to three professors, or yes, several brilliant professors who redirected my life between 1968 and 1970. I think one of them was John Shem, and another one was Jennifer Fletcher, and the third,
Anthony Blunt.
Well, tell us more, and get closer to your microphone, about Anthony Blunt. You used not to be allowed to speak about him in public, but it's perfectly okay now. And
I'm happy about that.
We all think, no problem, whatever, because we think of him now as an art historian, an architectural historian. We've completely forgotten anything else about him. And you don't have to go into your role in the, and you can just talk about him as an inspiration for you and for his work on architecture and what it meant for you.
And I can reassure my neighbour here that I'm one of His Majesty's loyalist subjects. Yes, well, Anthony Blunt really really is responsible for changing views. Of course, he was the most wonderful scholar, and he was the most inspiring teacher. And in 1968, we knew nothing about his
Other activities.
Yes. Thank you. And we just knew him as the most wonderful teacher. And indeed, I would not be here but for him. As Nicholas is probably about to ask me, going further into my dim and distant past, I was brought up in Australia, and I did my first degree at Sydney University entirely on political subjects. And then was shunted into the Australian Foreign Service, which I didn't really adapt to. Well, it didn't suit me, and I didn't suit them, I'm sure. Anyway, morale was very low at one point, 1966-67, because of Australia's involvement in what was going on in Vietnam. The younger members of the Foreign Service thought it was all very misguided, etc. But anyway, morale was pretty rife, and I'd always been threatening to go off and do a degree in fine art, not knowing whether there was such a thing. However, totally demoralized on one particular occasion, I went to the British Council and found out that there was. It was called the Coldfield Institute, where it was held. And yes, they'd get me application forms that they didn't think I had a hope in hell. But they came, and I filled them in, and I thought I'd let off steam, and I'd be posted to Rome, and everything would be okay. Except that I kept looking more and more forward to the response, which inevitably was, thank you for your application, but we're afraid we've been able to fill the course with people who have some experience in the subject. I don't know what prompted me to write back, because I never thought there was any point in arguing with the official mind, but I did, and I said, well, I fully understood their position, and it placed people from Australia in a sadly circular position, because until there was somebody from Australia, with or without art historical experience or not, there would be nobody to give people in Australia the experience they needed. Anthony Blunt himself wrote back and said, we were so moved by your argument, we hope you're still available. Anyway, it turned out by chance I didn't really know who he was, except I had read his volume on the Pelican History of Art in France, Architecture and Art and Architecture in France. But by chance, because for some reason in remote Australia, I was addicted to Baroque architecture, of which there is very little. One or two lovely Victorian examples, yes, but that's all. Anyway, I chose it because and as it turned out, he was the principal lecturer, principal tutor on the architecture side of it. So, there.
Well, that moment,
it's rather a long answer.
No, not at all. No, just perfect amount of time you spent on it. But I'm interested. I was going to ask you about how you met the angel Gabriel, but Gabrielle. But I thought, in fact, now you mention it and mention your previous career, that you've always emphasized the context of architecture. And when we read this book, you really wish there was less context. I mean, because the dream of the architectural historian must be that there was a great patron who knew exactly what he wanted, and a perfect building was created, and it stopped. But this is not what happened with the evolving palaces.
But that's an exact description of Louis XV.
Yes,
Not
if you
14th,
wanted.
but 15th. Well, Louis XIV knew as well, but Louis XV had taste.
Yes, important quality which we'll come on to. But this, it couldn't be mine, but it's not. Oh, it is. It's put in my coat pocket. It's usually my brother who sends me at this time. But at this moment, when you were arriving at the Courtauld, I think I'm right in saying that Mark Girouard's book on the, I've never spoken to you about this before, on the English country house came out, which I remember revolutionized people thinking about English architecture. And I wondered if that, you feel that there was a sort of moment when people were more interested in all the other things that conditioned architecture rather than beautiful plans and beautiful elevations.
I wish I could say I was so enlightened as to have done all that, but I wasn't. I spent some time, a very limited amount of time, in Paris on my way from Sydney to London. It was supposed to have been 6 months, but les événements of May 1968 curtailed overseas scholarships until the French ambassador in Canberra said, wrote back to the ministry and said that he didn't think a young Australian diplomat would be rioting in the streets, so they restored my scholarship, but unfortunately there was too little left. However, I did have plenty of time to wander around Paris and fall in love with Gabriel's architecture. And when I finished my MA, and Anthony thought there was some point in my staying on and doing a PhD, and we rummaged through subjects, I said, not really as an afterthought, but somewhere down the line, there were all sorts of painters and other things were suggested. What about Gabriel? He said, oh, that's a wonderful subject. I always wanted to do it, but never will now. So he wrote off to Michel Guellet in Paris, who said, oh, that's a wonderful subject. I always want to do it, but I never do it now. So yes, it's free. Let him get on with it. And that's
Incredible timing, actually.
very good.
Because after all, he is such a wonderful architect.
And it turned out to be the most wonderful project to be working on because of the huge wealth of documentation in the Archives Nationales. There were hundreds of plans, elevations, and sections in different boxes. There were even more hundreds of written documents, and all of these had been organized, had been catalogued by a man called, an Englishman called Curzon in the 19th century. But he had only just identified which chateau the drawings applied to. Sometimes got it wrong, which is fortunate. Also, other people, of course, had dug into this before, but French architecture historians at the end of the 19th and early 20th century were mainly interested in documenting what had been built. They weren't really interested in unexecuted projects, which was wonderful for me because the vast wealth of this corpus of documents was unexecuted. And piecing all that together was really challenging. These documents were, as I said, the plans in black for what had been built, in red for what was to be changed, a beautifully drawn, absolutely immaculate illustration, everything absolutely gorgeous. But the written documents were, because, well, let me go back a bit. Each of the chateaux had a contrôleur, an architectural for works going on there, had a contrôleur. Each chateau was a department with a contrôleur for the architectural works. So, when a project for that chateau had been approved by the king, signed Louis, then it was sent off to the contrôleur, whose job it was to execute it exactly. And there would, of course, been working drawings, the engineering ones, everything. Every fortnight, either Gabriel himself or the Marquis de Marigny, the Director General of Buildings, Gabriel's boss, would go and inspect what was being done. And in between, the controller regularly would write back and say, we're up to the first course of masonry. We're putting on the roof frame. His Majesty came yesterday. He climbed up on the roof frame. He was thrilled with what we're doing, etc., etc. It was absolutely wonderful. And then to cap all that, I mean, in addition to all that, there are the memoirists. There was the Prince de Cuy, and there was the Duc de Luynes. Prince de Cuy was a close friend of the king. The Duc de Luynes was a close friend of the queen. And sometimes, very rarely, when there was a missing link in the drawings, for instance, in the king's bedroom at Fontainebleau, which was being redone, keeping most of the Louis XIII's basic panelling, but redoing the pseudo-porte, all the plans showed putti holding up ovals, elliptical medallions. But in the room, they are pièce d'armes holding them up, trophy d'armes. When was this change made? I mean, there was nothing in the document to tell me that. Luynes, in his report, said, went to see the new work in the king's bedroom today with Her Majesty. I was pleased to see that Mr. Gabriel had been asked to change the putti for place d'armes on the 23rd of April last, or something like that. It was absolutely astonishing how those memoirists filled things. And incidentally, when I said about Louis XV and his taste, Coy tells us about that. He came, we knew, everybody knew Louis XV was interested in architecture. He spent a lot of money on it. Anyway, he came to the court one day with his drawings for his hunting lodge near Lille to show the king. And he showed it to the king and said, oh, good, architecture, right up his sleeve, call Monsieur Gabriel. And so the king sat down with Gabriel and looked at the plans and redesigned the hunting lodge, after which the king cited par Louis, architect de Monsieur de Coy.
Well, this conversation is developing very, very interestingly, because there's many opportunities for. Are you a controller? You know,
A controller now? I'm
no,
not.
you're
too long.
No, you're
They
not.
look after buildings, they're all.
No, but you actually have frequent contact with His Majesty, and must often discuss projects of a kind. So you must have a real sympathy with this situation. And of course, I know you're inhibited in your in what you can really tell us about, daily life at court. But it is your life, and you're in charge of palaces and all those sort of things. The book has a special meaning for you. And I think now you must ask some very challenging questions to Christopher.
Thank you. Well, Christopher, we're used to you chewing off very large subjects. So, for instance, that 7-volume Context in Architecture series, with architecture from the Paleolithic times almost to the present day, or your great survey of Indian architecture. But, I mean, why the Louvre and Versailles? Are there not two volumes?
I wanted to do it in one. I wanted to trace the continuity from the one to the other without that sort of break.
And there are quite a number of, French art history is notoriously chauvinistic, and doubtless architectural history too.
Well, they hated me for Gabriel.
Tell, yeah. How did you get through the thickets of enmity and?
Well, I suppose it didn't cheer one up, but they didn't quite know what to say in the review of the book on Gabriel, so they attacked my quite frequent lapses in the French rather than in the architecture. Anyway, that went on in the reviews in 1978. But in the year 2000, answering your question, but this may sound slightly hubristic, and I don't mean to be, but to answer your question. There was a seminar held in Paris to discuss a book by a German scholar on Claude Perrault. And one of the issues that I address in there is how far he can be credited with responsibility for the colonnade. And this one of the main topics of this seminar was to come to terms with that. And I presented the argument that I presented there against an American professor called Robert Bircher, whose argument is also there. Anyway, the French did come down on my side, grudgingly, but they had to because they thought it was actually right. But then we were given free run for climbing over the structure of the colonnade. And as we were climbing up a spiral staircase, I was being shown by some young French architectural historians. And I said to them, oh, here we must be in the part that Gabriel actually did to make the building sound and roof it and get access to above. And I said, I know because I once wrote a book on Gabriel. We know, it's our Bible.
Very good. So, I mean, actually, you
So
do
they're
advance,
nice to me, but not the older one.
in this book, you do advance a number of quite novel theses, such as the kind of Burgundian origins of the sort of French state apartment.
It's called Hispano-Burgundian rules of etiquette in designing palaces, and it was evolved probably by Philip the Bell. Anyway, for the Kudenberg Palace, in which it's there in Brussels, and Charles V, when he became, of course, Charles of Duke of Burgundy, Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he introduced Burgundian court etiquette to the Spanish court for his son, who he was leaving virtually as viceroy there. That's why it's called Hispano-Burgundian, because they were the ones who involved the massive, well, it was Philip the Bell who involved the massive line of which distinguishes the massive line of antechambers. 9 he had. The Spanish somehow made do with 6. But that idea of multiple antechambers, multiple places for the courtiers, the would-be the would-be seekers of audience to be sorted out till they got to the king. That was developed there. But I maintain it was introduced to France, to the Louvre, not, well, to the French court, not by Louis XIV, which was often thought at Versailles, but actually by his mother. And yes, for her summer apartments. I don't know why the French haven't picked this up, and I don't know where they're going to tell me I went wrong with this, and I'm quite happy to be told that I am, but she had 6 antechambers.
So they're not content
And
with
that's
that.
the first time.
Not content with that, you also kind of rearrange the iconography on the on some of the the 16th century facades of the Louvre, giving it a completely different interpretation than it is.
I thought it was
hitherto.
necessary to project the symbolism of the triumph. Well, I mean, you can see that there are triumphal arches on the facade of the Louvre. There it is, on the front of another version of this. That you can see that's the key motive on the facade of the Louvre. But what I wanted to do was to say that was the final triumphal arch in the whole sequence of triumphal arches that had marked the route of Henry II's state entry into Paris. There were a lot of them. They're all in here too. And to relate the design of the Louvre to the triumph of the king to absolutism. That's what I was trying to do there.
And then moving on to Versailles, I mean, Nicholas, do interrupt.
You move on to Versailles.
Nicholas, moving on to Versailles, this great Jean-Jacques Gabriel's great projected sort of reordering of the town front of Versailles, which of course was never completed thanks to, I think, your lovely phrase, the financial incontinence of the French crown.
That's right.
Tell us more about that.
Well,
And why it wasn't realised apart from this incontinence problem.
Louis XV appointed, well, Henri Jacques Gabriel succeeded his father as premier architect in 1742. Louis XV by now was, he came to the throne, as you know, in 1715 at the age of 5. By 1735, he was already becoming a mature patron of architecture, and I've already told you how we know he was really keen on it. By 42, Gabriel, who was only a little older, perhaps 10 years older, 12 years older, was much more in the king's entourage, I suppose. And he commissioned him to finally address the long-standing disenchantment that the French architectural establishment had had with the front of the Louvre that had been inherited by Versailles, which had been inherited from Louveau, badly built as well. I mean, it was falling down.
This is the little hunting lodge in the middle.
The little hunting lodge, and then Louveau put the envelope around it and built all those wings that stick out in the front. But they weren't well built, and the style was in brick and stone and antiquated and sort of pseudo-baroque. They wanted something that matched the architectural dignity, the gravitas of the garden front. And so Gabriel was commissioned to do that. And the first project was, in fact, very closely based on the garden front. So closely that my predecessors took these particular drawings, that the first identifiable ones for redoing the town front, as drawings by Claude Mansart, who done that garden front. And that was what prevented them, happily for me, from getting on with unraveling the long drawn-out story of the Grand Projet for the Louvre, because a scholar in 1923 had identified that as the first project for the Louvre, but by Mansart, but nobody went any further than that. I, by sheer luck, found in 2 different boxes these drawings, and in another box a plan which exactly matched those drawings, the elevation, where the columns are, where the doors are, where the windows are, etc., the projections and the recessions. All that was exactly matched by this plan. And I could date that plan to after 1728, because it had a change to the Duchess of Orleans apartment, which we knew about in 1728, and another change represented only in Blondel, Jacques-François Blondel's plan of a decade later. So we knew that these drawings were not by François Mansart, but had to be by Gabriel. And that's where unraveling the entire sequence began.
And was it just money that kind of made it impossible? Or was it also, I think you suggest, that the kind of needs of the various members of the royal family and the incessant kind of reordering of their apartments and things like that kind of, in a way, kind of made it impossible to have this unified vision?
The Grand Project was revived every time there was going to be an increase in the royal family. This first one in 42, 43 was because the Dauphin was about to get married and would need an entire new set of accommodations. And they thought that was going to be, and an opera house and all the rest of it, that was going to be the time. But with the War of the Austrian Succession just about to break out, or virtually had broken out, there was no money. And that was the story all the way through, when there was peace, and when there was likely to be, for instance, all the grandchildren of the king, they all needed apartments in the 60s and 70s. But each time there was some crisis that prevented money. But most of the money that might, incidentally, it's thought that it was royal buildings which bankrupted France and was one of the underlying causes of the revolution. That's absolute rubbish. At the height of the war, of the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 63, at the height of that war, the annual budget was 179 million livres. And I don't know what the relationship between a French livre and an English pound at that time was, but 179 million of them. The royal budgets annually for building had been 1.9 billion, of which usually there was a supplement of up to 3 million. So let us say 4 to 5 million out of a wartime annual budget of 159 is not a bankrupting exercise. Where that 4 million, annual 4 million went, more or less annual 4 million went, was on Louis XV's obsession with change, with changing the royal apartments. I was chasing the baths around 3 or 4 stories of the Palace of Versailles throughout this entire. If the bath was moved to the upper story, the library had to be moved to the ground floor, the kitchens had to be moved to the attic, etc. That's where the money went.
And talk a little bit about the kind of afterlife of Versailles. I mean, you have a section on the kind of legacy of these great palaces, of which, of course, I suppose, in a way, the east front of Buckingham Palace is, which you don't mention. Actually.
I did. I dismissed it.
Oh,
I dismissed it in.
This is the 1913 Aston Webb refacing of Buckingham Palace, which is always said to be Gabrielle, sort of an elegant essay in Gabrielle, but controversial as that. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I wish they'd studied Gabrielle.
Well, your book hadn't been brought out in 1913.
Now, this is a very important aspect of your book. At the end, it explodes into, I mean, we all thought you might mention Caserta or whatever, and we all thought maybe you'd go to Potsdam. But you go to about 10 other places.
Heron Chiemsee, it ends up with a flourish.
Yes,
the mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria is actually very Versailles-like.
What's an exact copy?
Yeah.
And Stockholm you go to, yes. I mean, you go everywhere, in fact.
Well,
but it's extremely, I mean, it's a very important part of the book, I think. And it suddenly makes the subject central to European architecture.
When I wrote the précis for this and submitted it to my wonderful commissioning editor, Fran Ford, who's here and to whom all this is owed, a lot of this is owed because Tom Neville, who was my editor too. Anyway, when I presented that to her, she sent it out necessarily to a couple of reviewers, one of whom, who may actually be with us tonight, suggested that it would be a good idea if I traced the influence of these palaces on other palaces later. And I did. That's why I did it, because I was suggested by one of these very kind reviewers. Way back then.
Well,
and it was fun too, yes, from Stockholm to here in Chiemsee.
Yes, that's the trajectory. But
And in the opening paragraph about Blenheim, I do mention Buckingham
Yeah,
Palace.
Blenheim gets a little look in. Actually, the British Isles is not, well, as you can see, you rejected poor old east front of Buckingham Palace, but yes, Blenheim Palace with its kind of rise and fall, its sort of outbuildings and so on. And of course, very tempting because Louis XIV's nemesis, the Duke of Marlborough, is the patron there. Yeah.
But Andrew had been in France and came back with all those ideas ripped off mainly from the verb, but anyway. Yeah.
To conclude, shall we just ask one more question? What's the next project?
Well, I find I need one, and I have raised with wonderful Fran the idea of, I don't know how people find books these days. That history of architecture that you mentioned in 7 volumes, they are very heavy volumes, about 900 pages each. What bookseller is going to take up his valuable bookshelf space with heavy volumes that he knows people are going to come in and look at, but say, oh yes, this is interesting, but far too heavy for me to carry away, and order it on Amazon? How therefore, if you can't see them in bookshops anymore, how therefore do you know about them and how to buy them? I don't know that, but I imagine people search online. And so if, for instance, they want a book on the Louvre, they may very well find it, mine. But if they want a book on let us say, Baroque architecture, I doubt if they're going to necessarily realize that my sixth volume in that series, called Transformations, is actually about Baroque architecture. So I suggested to Fran that we might completely revise that volume, at least the part of that volume that deals with the Baroque, and republish it rather in the way this has been completely revised and republished, under the title of Baroque Architecture and Decoration and Rococo Decoration. That is what toying with the idea. It all depends on several factors.
It's an extremely important topic with which to end, actually, and not necessarily to end, because we might elicit or questions concerning this as to how best to publicise work that's been done some time ago, quite often, and how to get people to the right books. And I think that you should take chunks that you've written and actually put them free of charge online. Of course, you need publishers to agree to this.
I'm going to say, address this question to Routledge.
It is something that they themselves actually have come around to do from time to time. So for someone who hits on Petit Trianon will get an enticing passage or two that you've written on it, and will think, well, where did this come from? And then they'll, be led back to that bookshop, or at least to that book. So,
Thank you.
is it wrong now to...
Yes, I'd like to invite questions from our audience tonight. I mean, can I take chair's privilege or host privilege and ask one question of you, Christopher? But I think people will be really fascinated to know how you work as an architectural historian, how it sounds from just that, those walks around Paris in the late 60s, early 70s, when you were falling in love with the Gabriel's architecture, and then your discussion of going through those hundreds of plans. For you, is it really about close attention to detail in the archive and the physical experience of these buildings that's central to your understanding of them? Well, it'd be great I think for our students and for, I think, people generally to hear about how you go about or how you've gone about the project of putting an argument or putting a book together about a particular subject in the architectural field.
Well, I suppose the answer is exactly that. Certainly with my original book on Gabriel, it was the absolute pleasure of mining those archives, and indeed of walking around Paris and not just observing, taking photographs. I spent a lot of my life traveling and photographing buildings, and I suppose the idea of writing the history of architecture in India emerged from that. I'd been there, I'd seen a certain strata with a certain type of Indian building. And then when I got my job in Canterbury as the senior lecturer in architecture history, I tried to diversify. This is a tangential answer. Tried to diversify the course in architectural history from its prevailing Euro, indeed Anglo, indeed Ren centricity, to embrace cultures which were considered alien to most of us then, to India, China, Japan. And I tried to find somebody to do a lecture, to insert in my syllabus a lecture on India to start with. There wasn't anybody. And having been there, having taken some photographs, I thought I'd better do it too. Then I realized there wasn't really an adequate text either. The last one had been written in a very stultifying and stilted style in the late 20s and early 30s by a very worthy man who was the director of the museum in Calcutta, but pretty impenetrable as prose. And so I thought, so I did. And so there comes to be, I suppose in that case, there came to be a perceived need. There was a bit of a background. I'd seen quite a lot of the buildings. I'd got the material photographed, etc. And then I just launched into it. And then in that case, there was the wonderful resource of the India Office Library in Blackfriars Bridge Road, and I spent much of my life, other than when I was actually teaching, there, burrowing away there. And then back in those days, and I'm now talking about the late 70s, we didn't actually have word processors, and having it typed up by my long-suffering first wife, and then, if ever there were changes, which of course there inevitably were from the first draft, it was a nightmare trying to change typescripts with Gestetner paper and all that, remember? Anyway, I suppose seeing the buildings, taking the photographs, doing the archival research, which in the case of India was largely not so much original drawings, there weren't any, but accounts of the buildings going back to largely to James Ferguson in the 19th century. But huge amount of literature to get to. With Gabriel, it was very different. It was, as you said, walking around, seeing the buildings, taking a photograph, and then having that agreed as a subject that I could do, then spending the summer, actually, during my writing of the thesis, and then an extended period to turn the thesis into a book in those archives. I'm sorry, that's not quite the answer you want.
It's really interesting to hear how...
And then I would be up in my study, as my long-suffering second wife knows, beavering away writing the damn thing. But now on a word processor, so I could do all the changes myself.
Good. Very interesting indeed. We've got a few minutes left before we can finally turn to having a drink and a celebratory toast for Christopher next door. But any questions that anyone would like to ask, prompted by a really fascinating conversation between our three panelists? Yes.
Christopher, the model that you've supplied is effectively that of Hugh Murray-Bailey. In other words, looking at the relationship of etiquette to architecture. You posited that there is a major change in the architecture of the French court by the imitation of the Burgundian mode. Does that actually change anything in the actual etiquette, offices, office holding of the French court or not?
Ironically, it wasn't necessary for Louis XIV, because like all the French kings, it wasn't necessary for Louis XIV. But like most of his predecessors, the French kings claimed to be unique in Europe for the direct access that their people could have to them. And in fact, Francis I, in all that he did at Fontainebleau, and indeed in what he was planning, and Henry II succeeded at the Louvre, did not have a huge succession of antechambers to weed out the would-be, because they wanted to be immediately accessible. It was, however, Catherine de' Medici, terrified after the battle of the setup, but all the wars of religion in France, who, and especially her son Henry III, well, she for Charles IX and then Henry III himself, they wanted this sense of greater protection from potential damage. They, the late Valois, did. The earlier Valois didn't, but the late ones did because of the troubles. And then the early Bourbons didn't want this remoteness, and Louis XIV later didn't, but after the Fronde, his mother did, both for him, but also for her. And that, Catherine de' Medici did introduce the Hispano-Burgundian court etiquette, which her daughter, as Queen of Spain, would have been telling her all about. And she, I'm quite sure, it's the connection between Catherine and her daughter Elizabeth in Spain that prompted Catherine to design Charleval, for instance, for her son Charles IX, with these massive numbers of antechambers, the first time. And then...
So how does that actually change the etiquette? I mean, the real problem...
Well, it didn't happen.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right.
But
Can I just point out...
But yeah, I could answer your question. But for later, when it did happen, for Anne of Austria in the summer apartments underneath the Pitti Gallery, she makes it clear that those 6 rooms that precede her bedroom are going to be used to sort out who she's going to allow to have access to her. So it did change for them. Louis XIV, when he went to Versailles, in order to get away from Paris and the memory of the Fronde, went back to the idea of being immediately accessible.
But sorry, isn't the fundamental point that Burgundian etiquette is merely a provincial version of the French anyway? In other words, the centrality of the bedchamber in both, as opposed to the Hugh Murray Bailey's description of the English court. The French court and the Burgundian are organized by time. The English court is organized by place. In other words, rooms that remain public or private all the time. The French, like the Burgundian, the bedchamber shifts by time. That always remains the case.
It's not central. In Burgundian court etiquette, especially as evolved by Philip the Fair in Kuenberg, which I reproduced there, the bedchamber is at the end of the succession of 9, and beyond the bedchamber are all the private rooms. So
I think actually that this is one of those wonderful occasions when it's clear that a seminar within a seminar is the subject I propose for the future seminar is that of the shifting bedchamber and multiplied antechambers and so on. And it's going to be an incredible debate. But I wouldn't want to inhibit the discussion of any other aspects of...
Any other questions from any other guests? We've got one here.
Yeah, there's one.
Thank you, Christopher, very much indeed. Really lovely to hear you talk. You've spoken very engagingly about your own teacher in Anthony Blunt. Has your teaching shaped your writing in any way, do you think?
there are 2 former students here. You might ask them. I think they did, very much so, yes.
Was it their ignorance or their knowledge that...
It was their enthusiasm to engage with what many architects think is a complete waste of time, which is the teaching of history, and therefore one's encouragement and I hope acquisition of a way of getting across that inbuilt inhibition, especially in young students who may think they're there really to learn how to build buildings, not to learn how buildings were built and what form they took in the past. Yes, it's the answer to that question would be another little seminar within a seminar, but yes, I do. I mean, it's famous. I think teachers with any degree of openness of mind would say they learn from their students. I hope I did. Yeah.
It's a very nice sentiment in this particular environment, I think, to hear. Maybe one last question before we finish. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question in response to any of the points that Christopher's made or the subjects that...
Except about bedchambers.
Except for the mobile bedchambers and what lies beyond the bedchamber. Any other last questions before we... No?
Mr. Can I make a comment?
Oh, yeah.
Not a question. But
Is it 1 second? There's a microphone coming your way, which might help.
It seems to me the debt of gratitude we owe you is the fact that you go and look at buildings and walk them and feel them, and then come back and do the necessary historical investigation into them. Because I remember, I was literally new, but I remember doing art history, and you saw it on a screen, and every picture was the same size, every building was the same size, and you came away feeling you knew these objects, but it wasn't until you actually confronted them that you felt that you really started to understand them. And one of the things that your books do, and what you've opened up, is the fact, and encourage your students to do, is actually go and look at these buildings, walk them, feel them, see how the light plays with them, how the ornament works. And for that, I think we owe you a great debt of gratitude.
Well, that's sweet of you to say, but that's why I take the photographs of the buildings myself, because I need to know those buildings. Of course, taking photographs actually can prevent you from looking at the buildings, but one does look and then one takes a photograph, because I know exactly what angle I need. And to help with the transition that you're talking about, we've been rigorous, Tom and I, Tom Neville, who puts the books together with me, in producing the plans, reproducing the plans to consistent scales, so that you will have those who are good at reading plans will see the disparity in the size, and also in consistent orientation with north at the top and east always. So in reproducing plans with this in mind, I try to give as many clues as possible to the scale of the works we're talking about.
Thanks very much. Well, that was a really wonderful discussion. Can I ask all of you to thank Christopher, of course, most of all.
Thank you, but may I thank you, Mark, and your team, Diego and all the other ones for organising this, for all of you for coming to a place that's not that easy to find. To Fran, Fran Ford, who I've already mentioned as the wonderful person who's made these books possible. To Tom Neville, and his partner Vicky, who Tom and I have worked together for 50 years, actually, on putting books together, since the book on India in the 80s, nearly 50 years. Thanks to them, again, would not have been possible without, God knows how he's put up with me for all those years, the patience, the changes, and all the rest of it. And then, of course, finally, to Juliet, because she famously, ladies are thought to marry the husbands for life but not for lunch, but she had to put up with me for lunch as well, while I busied away upstairs in between. Thank you, darling.